All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2025 Environmental Ethics Symposium. My name is Brian Birch, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics here at UVU. And before we get into the introductions, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone associated with this event. So I'd especially like to thank Christina Gibby and members of the committee who organized this symposium. I'd like to thank the staff of the Center for the Study of Ethics and most notably Courtney Burns for her involvement and organization. And I'd also like to thank faculty colleagues who are bringing their classes and otherwise involving their students in the session today. So all of the sessions here are going to be live streamed and recorded. So obviously we would love to have you show up in person, but if you're unable, everything is captured on our YouTube channel, and you can just visit the Center for the Study of Ethics channel to get all of our content there. So our theme this year is environmental ethics in the plastic age, and I just want to take a moment to recognize the person after whom this event is named. He was a dear friend and colleague of mine and many here on campus, David Keller. So this is officially named the David R. Keller Environmental Ethics Symposium. And David was the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics from 1999 until his passing in 2013. And it's been an honor for me to serve in this position and to maintain all the great work that David did in advancing this center. He was a tireless champion of environmental ethics and environmental studies more generally, and the person that really is responsible for making this event and many other events like it possible here on campus. I also want to make an announcement that we award a prize each year, also named in David Keller's honor. It's a sustainability prize that we award to organizations in our community who are advancing sustainability and providing leadership in related areas. So if any of you are interested in applying or know of an organization or person who might be interested in applying, on the sides of the room, we have QR codes where you can access the application information. And if you have any other questions, you can contact me directly, and I'm happy to sit down and visit with you more about it. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Yi Yin to introduce our first session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yi Ying. I'm the assistant professor in social and behavioral science department at UVU. It's my honor to introduce our speakers. Before that, I'm going to provide a friendly reminder for the students who attend today's event. You can scan the QR code on the back of the chairs, or you can scan the QR code on the door so that you can get your attendance credit. It's my honor to have our incredible speakers. Luke Peterson is the executive director of the Utah Lake Authority. He is a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School and has worked for local governments in 5 states. For the past 15 years, Luke has been involved in strategic communications, government relations, economic development, and cross-sector partnerships, and several other leadership roles in navigating major land use issues. He enjoys old maps and plans family trips around visits to presidential libraries. And it's my honor to introduce our another speaker. Addy Valdez is the Conservation and Education Programs Manager at the Utah Lake Authority. Addy has 2 bachelor's degrees in both biology and environmental science from Rocky Mountain College. She is pursuing a master's in natural resource stewardship from Colorado State University and will graduate in spring of 2026. Growing up on a rural Montana cattle ranch, Addy has inherent connection to the land. As a new resident of Utah, she has loved learning more about Utah Lake's complex and vibrant ecosystems and take pride in furthering conservation efforts on Utah Lake while working for ULA. Now let's welcome our speakers, and I'm going to hand it over to our speakers.
Right. I don't want to mess with this. Thank you, Dr. Yi, and thank you, Brian. It is a pleasure to be here. It's always good to be back home, which is how I feel about UVU, especially the Environmental Ethics Symposium. It wasn't in my bio, but I am a UVU graduate, and my story with UVU really begins with the Environmental Ethics Symposium. I got involved working with the Ethics Center that way, and I can draw sort of a direct line from that moment working with David Keller to where I am and what I do today. So it's good to be here. Um, we just did a quick intro, but just a reminder, I run the Utah Lake Authority. We're a small entity. We are an entity of the state of Utah, but we're not part of the Department of Natural Resources or the Department of Environmental Quality. We are a rare little unicorn, and that is a government startup. So we're a tiny little office really focused on just Utah Lake. And of course, it's important to have somebody focused on Utah Lake because it is going through a process, right? And I like to talk about this in terms of the phase shifts, ecological shifts that Utah Lake has gone through and that we see it going through. So before European settlement here in the valley, Utah Lake was in one state, and we don't know everything about it, but we know that it was clearer. We know that it had a lot more native species in it. We know that it had submerged vegetation that grew in it, and in all respects, it was generally healthier. And that was a state that it had evolved into over millennia. And then with the advent of European settlement, that changed very, very quickly. Agriculture moved into the valley. We had people putting their waste of all varieties into the lake. And during the late 1800s, the government thought it would be a great idea to plant some carp in there and just create a nightmare for me every day, basically. And those few carp multiplied and multiplied, crowded out a lot of the native species, and put us to where we were by, say, the 1960s, when the lake was really in serious trouble. Um, the communities here were dumping raw waste into the lake at the time. It was before the Clean Water Act, and the carp population had crowded out many species. The June sucker, which is one of those native species, was on the ropes. And by the 1990s, there were only about 300 June sucker left in Utah Lake. Now it's a keystone species that lets us know how the lake is doing. So it was in a really bad place. Now you fast forward to today, and a tremendous amount of work has been done, not just by us, state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofit conservation organizations, all kinds of people have contributed to improving the health of the lake. Now we have hundreds of thousands of June sucker in the lake. And what we're trying to do is get Utah Lake sort of over that hump and to a new stable state. We'll never return it to let's say, the pristine state it was in before European settlement, but we strongly believe we can find a new healthy, right? Something that embraces the reality that hundreds of thousands of people live around the shores of Utah Lake. Utah Lake is an urban lake, which is kind of a rare thing. And as far as I can ascertain, it is the only urban lake with this many people living around its immediate shores that is also experiencing this level of growth, right? So a lot of people and a lot of people being added all the time. So these pose really unique challenges for Utah Lake. And this leads to the first thing that I want to talk about, just to set the stage for what we're discussing today, which is the fact that Utah Lake is the dirtiest and most disgusting body of water in the world, right? I mean, look at it. It's practically, it looks like it's a toxic wasteland, right? It's just terrifying out there. At least this is the narrative that we hear all the time about Utah Lake. And it does not help that these listicle stories come out that make these sorts of claims. Utah Lake is the dirtiest lake in the United States. So this is an article, as you can see, from July 1, 2024. Now, in reality, nobody is actually sure when this article was first written. I think somewhere around 2015, and then it just gets recycled. Every few years, a different blog decides to post it and see how many hits they can get from it. So it, in theory, is attached to some study, but nobody actually knows who did it or when. But it's interesting to look, like, right off the bat, there's something interesting here. The second bullet point um, tells us that we've also got a bunch of lakes in Florida that have some serious lead contamination. But Utah Lake is the dirtiest. So what is the criteria used? And if you dig into this thing, it tells you that the criteria for ranking Utah Lake as the dirtiest lake is TDS, which refers to total dissolved solids. So it is the dirtiest, sort of in a very literal sense, like there's a lot of dirt in it. Okay. Now, this to me is an interesting criteria for ranking something, because the problem, of course, in the human mind is dirty and polluted are synonyms, right? We go dirty, polluted. And I hear this all the time. Utah Lake looks murky. It must be full of pollution. This is what I hear constantly from people. They want something that looks clearer, right? They want a body of water that, like, when they look at it, they can see the bottom. And what we're looking at here is a body of water that I think is partly in what people have in mind. This is part of the Cuyahoga. And the Cuyahoga, for those who don't know, is most famous for catching on fire, right? So a lake could be quite clear and maybe have some pollution problems. In order for a body of water to catch on fire, it has to be pretty polluted. And the Cuyahoga is actually why we had the Clean Water Act when it had this big fire. But that isn't the only fire it's had. In fact, I think the most recent one is from 2023, right here. I love the juxtaposition of the fire and the no littering sign. But, like, also, again, that water right there looks clearer than Utah Lake does on most days. And so we have to kind of press beyond really simple association to ask questions about, is Utah Lake truly as dirty and filthy and disgusting as people want to think, right? Because treating clear water as if it is something that's safe to recreate in and to use has been done all the time, right? This also sadly from Ohio, right? You got a bunch of people happily swimming in water clearly marked as polluted. Utah Lake is not polluted, right? I mean, by objective standards, it's a very clean lake. In fact, it's cleaner than many of the lakes within the state of Utah, if we're talking in terms of pollutants that we would actually be concerned about. Yet the concerns, and this is from a survey that we did, the concerns tell a different story. So when we asked people to compare different areas of concern between Utah Lake and other lakes, you can see, without going through all the categories, that first column of Utah Lake has a lot more red and orange than the other lakes, right? People see it as being much dirtier, more dangerous, more unhealthy than these other bodies of water. It does have challenges. It has harmful algal blooms. So do all the other bodies of water. But Utah Lake has been treated as sort of the poster child for harmful algal blooms. And this year certainly hasn't helped, because we had a very bad algal bloom this year. which is what happens when we have sustained heat and dry period like we did this summer. But Utah Lake as a whole is doing quite well. And the point that I try to make anytime I get a chance to speak to an audience is that while we have a lot of work to do, right? Tremendous amount of work left to do. And we're holding our Utah Lake Symposium next week where we'll be announcing sort of some of our big initiatives to improve the health of the lake. Um, while we have a lot of work to do, Utah Lake right now is the healthiest it's been in 100 years. And that is something that we should celebrate and sort of embrace. So I wanted to provide that context as we move into this discussion specifically about plastics and Utah Lake, which is a point where I turn it over to somebody. Oh, first of all, this is also, if you haven't seen our ad campaign, why we decided to run an ad campaign with fake tourists from Europe visiting Utah Lake for the first time. These ads were designed by Harmon Brothers, which is a Provo company, does a lot of humorous ads, but were they were importantly they were developed with really rigorous research and data in order for us to figure out like exactly what type of messaging will help us get through to people who are allowing mythology to take the place of reality where Utah Lake is concerned. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Addy, who actually knows what she's talking about when it comes to lake and science. So there we go.
All right, well, hello everybody. Hopefully, maybe I can lift this up a tiny bit. Okay, hopefully that's better. All right, great. Well, I think Luke gave a really great background to some of the more human aspects that come to Utah Lake, why we see it the way it is, and why it's had so many issues and this massive reputation that has come along with it. But I'm going to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of a little bit of the science and why we actually have those myths and why we believe those things we do. But some stuff that we want to talk about in general first with Utah Lake, a little bit more of the stats, is there's three major tributaries to Utah Lake. There's the Provo, American Fork, and Spanish Fork, and so many other smaller tributaries that flow into Utah Lake. We are at the bottom of the watershed, which is a great way to think of like a big bowl, and we are at the very bottom of the bowl. We have about 144 square miles of surface area, or 94,000 square acres of surface area, which that just means it's a really big lake. People definitely underestimate how big it is, how large it is. And there's so many values that come with having a lake like this in our valley that are ecological, communal, recreational. There's just endless opportunities for us to continue to use and work with Utah Lake. So a lot of people definitely underestimate how big it is, but also undervalue some of the services that it can really offer. So this is just a picture showing what these watersheds look like. So this is our entire watershed. On, I guess, your right, it's going to be Utah Lake's watershed, kind of picturing it out, cut out a little bit, like cookie cutter. And this is just showing how many tributaries and how much of the watershed flows into Utah Lake. And this is important because, again, that bowl aspect, a lot of water and a lot of runoff then is coming in to Utah Lake. We're acting as the bottom of the bowl. So we're catching and collecting a lot of what's coming from upstream. So it's very interesting to see just how big Utah Lake is compared to this watershed, though, and even comparing it to the Salt Lake watershed, which we are a part of as well. But Utah Lake is just massive. It's huge, and people truly underestimate what that means. And there's kind of some weird little nuances that come with Utah Lake and how big it is. Specifically, it's a full marathon long and half marathon wide. That's why we get such a large surface area. But the problem that comes with that makes it more interesting and a little more unique than other lakes is that it's shallow. It's only about 9 feet deep on average, which is very odd for lakes this big. You think about Lake Tahoe, that is like I think 1,000 feet deep at some of its deepest, or the Great Lakes that are absolutely massive and basically like mini oceans. So Utah Lake is very unique in how shallow it is, but that's because it's so old. It's literally almost old as dirt. And so it's a remnant of Terminal Lake Bonneville. So that just means that there's nowhere for this lake to go. So Lake Bonneville, just like the Great Salt Lake now, is a terminal basin. So again, it's at the bottom of that watershed and it has nowhere to drain to. And that's why the Great Salt Lake has so many things like why it's so salty and why it's collected heavy metals and so many other things. And Utah Lake is basically just a small step up from that. So we are a remnant of this lake. We are very old geologically. So that's why we have so much sediment, why we are so, quote, dirty, and why we are so shallow, because we're very, very old. We're not this lake that was dug up by excavators, by people to create a reservoir. We're not in a mountain. We're at the very bottom of a basin. So that creates a very flat bottom bowl. And then the other thing that comes along with all of these factors is eutrophic. Even previously, before we had all these state changes in settlement, it was likely still a somewhat eutrophic lake. And that just means it's higher in phosphorus and nitrogen. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people think that's terrible, but if you think about Lake Powell, it's hypoeutrophic. So that means it's almost sterile. It doesn't have hardly any nutrients. So that's why it's not having any of these things like algal blooms. But that's also why it doesn't support a lot of life either. So having nitrogen and phosphorus isn't a bad thing, but when it gets bad is when it becomes hypereutrophic, and that's what we are now. We're too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus. So this is again just showing how large we are and what Lake Bonneville used to look like. So Lake Bonneville was almost a third of our state. It's massive. And you can kind of see some of the remnants of what we once were. So we have the Great Salt Lake, Utah Lake, and Lake Sevier, which is a little bit farther down south. But I think the picture on the right really just shows how much of the lake takes up Utah Valley and Utah County specifically, and how large it is relative to our urban area that we've created over time. It's pretty impressive. I think what you see the satellite imagery, it's like, oh, whoa, that's out there. And so I think that's important to acknowledge that it's not just this tiny little pond that we're working with, even though it is as shallow as a pond. So I think I'm going to touch a little bit more on the history and the human influences that have affected Utah Lake. Luke hit on kind of the general gist of them, and I'm going to just get a little bit deeper because this really explains, like, how did things get so messed up here? How did things go so awry? And sadly, humans are to blame, per usual, for some of our more environmental challenges that we face. So, first we had pre-settlement. This is when we had our clear water, native fish, and we most importantly had natural flows. So this is like natural spring flooding from upper tributaries, and we also had natural outflows going to the Jordan River. And so everything like that was more stabilized. And then you get settlement coming in, where we bring in agriculture, that brings in massive irrigation poles. We bring in grazing, and then also just pollution and land changes. Landscape changes are important in Utah County. Again, looking at our picture, we just saw that this urban pressure is right on the edge of Utah Lake. It's not like the reservoirs where we're like 10 miles away. We are literally on the border. We are right there. And that land use change is very important because a lot of the land that used to surround Utah Lake, if you drive by like agriculture fields and the airports even, they're built on wetlands because they're very flat and they're easy to build on. And so that's historically what a lot of humans have done. But wetlands are really important to lakes and the basins that they reside in because they act as pollutant filters, they control water flooding, and really stabilize the environment around these lakes. And they also are a major biodiversity wildlife. Oh, sorry, this keeps cutting out and it's like messing me up a little bit. But they are also major biodiversity hotspots. So this in all created a state change. This is what Luke touched on with that last picture, and I'm going to show it again, actually. So it's a shift from a relatively stable natural system where it's resilient and resistant. So that just means it's like a rubber band. It can withstand, it's really hard to pull apart. That means it's resistant, but it's resilient as well. So if you snap the rubber band, it's going to come back into shape. So it's a stable state that it's existing in. But now we're in this more nutrient-rich and human-dominated and human-influenced state. So again, this is just showing another picture, a little bit more simplified of what Luke was showing. Then now we are in this alternate stable state. So again, it's resistant and it's resilient, but not in the way that we want. We want it to make change now. So when these ecosystems like we are now are resilient and resistant, it makes it really hard to shift them back into another stable state that we are desiring for. Because again, this rubber band is hard to stretch, and when we snap it, it likes to go back into place. And so that can be a good and a bad thing sometimes. And urbanization and just our overall population growth of Utah and Utah County specifically has really put a lot of pressure on Utah Lake. Again, that land use change has really caused a lot of issues with wetland degradation, agricultural uses, pulling water, and then just urban growth. That urban pressure along our shorelines is very critical. And then again, the addition of concrete, impervious surfaces are very interesting. So they are really great for us. They make our buildings stable and create foundations for our whole communities, but they also are these surfaces that don't absorb any water. So AKA, if you're going to throw some oil down on it, the oil's just going to slide off and go somewhere lower. And so this has really increased our runoff that we have in the valley and then also our pollutant delivery. So that just means, again, if you're fertilizing your lawn and then you rinse it off, all of that fertilizer that's coming off your lawn is going in a storm drain and that's going down the concrete into our water bodies. And so wastewater is also another thing that we have to think about. With more people equals more waste. So the more humans we have in Utah Valley, which is a lot, the more wastewater discharge that we are going to have. It has to go somewhere. And we have just decided that it's going in water. That's the easiest way for us to deal with it. It has gotten a lot better since the Clean Water Act. I don't want people to think that we're just like dumping raw waste into any of our water bodies anymore, especially Utah Lake. But it is still putting that extra nitrogen and extra phosphorus into our water bodies that create it to be hypertrophic. So that's, again, an issue with what we're trying to fix. And humans overall, we have put a lot of pressure and created a lot of challenges for ourselves to fix now. We've added this pressure that their environments just aren't used to. Humans are a very new disturbance or a very new challenge that's coming into the environment and making it difficult for the environment to respond because we are so extreme. So this is a great example on the right here of what stormwater runoff in those impervious surfaces can look like. So even things like from your roof, it's going to run off, go into your lawn, go into the street, and then go into your water. And the picture on the left shows, again, how much urban interface is directly on Utah Lake's shoreline. It's a large percentage of it. I think there's over 700,000 residents living within 2 miles-ish. I want to say 2 to 3 miles of Utah Lake shoreline. It's a lot. So it's a lot of people and not a lot of water because remember, it's only 9 feet deep, even though it's really big. So again, this is a major problem that we're running into. And this water over time, because of these things that we have created, we've gotten some consequences. Who would have thought? And so algae blooms are a big issue, not only in Utah Lake, but actually all over the world now that humans have become really good at putting nitrogen and phosphorus out there. We've had this massive nutrient loading. So that, again, leads to eutrophication. So there's just excess nitrogen, excess phosphorus, and those are the key things that plants need to grow, aka algae. And another thing that leads to this is sedimentation. So because we have changed how our shoreline works with that land use change, and that we also manage Utah Lake as a reservoir and not a natural lake anymore, we get this buildup of sediment. That's what happens when you dam things. Sediment isn't naturally allowed to flow outwards anymore. It just kind of stays stagnant where it originally is, and it starts to build up. And we've already had that because, again, it's a geologic old lake, so it has a lot of sediments regardless, but now we're just making that even worse. And invasive species are another massive issue that we deal with. So Luke already touched on carp. They are really bad because they worsen turbidity. So turbidity is the total dissolved solids, aka the dirt in the water column. And carp love to eat things on the bottom of the sediment. So they basically dig around in it and they're looking for vegetation. So one, they eat all the vegetation that's actually rooted in the sediments. And then two, they churn it all up and keep it active in the water column. So not great. The other invasive species that we've dealt with a lot and are making a lot of progress on is Phragmites. So this is an invasive tall grass from Eurasia, and it basically comes in, creates this huge monoculture that grows very dense. It's a major safety issue for people, get lost in it, it can catch on fire, and it basically just decreases our biodiversity on our lake. And so that was a major issue as well, creating this huge monodominant hypereutrophic culture on Utah Lake. And then we all do have these industrial legacies that do exist on Utah Lake with wastewater treatment plants, but also steel plants and other factories that have existed historically on Utah Lake that definitely did their damage before the Clean Water Act for sure. There's been a lot of cleanup since then, but it is important to acknowledge that those did exist and have these industrial legacies on our water. So this is just an example of what harmful algal blooms can look like when they're at their worst. So you can see the little like rescue boats out there, and it's pretty impressive how dark it is. And that just is an indicator of how much algae is in there and how concentrated it is. And I don't want you to think that algae is the bad thing. It's harmful algae. It's actually called cyanobacteria, and that just means it's a hybrid between bacteria and algae that live together. And the bacteria part is actually the issue because it creates toxins. Regular algae, though, that's no problem. That exists everywhere. You can just do a stick test. If you just poke a stick in there and it comes off on a mat, it's safe. So don't worry about it. But I don't want you to think algae is the culprit. It's the harmful algae that is actually our issue that we face. So now I guess getting more to the point of why we're actually here talking about plastics in the emerging contaminant world that we're facing. Humans have already done so much damage that we've already recorded, but now we're moving into this phase, this new frontier that we aren't really sure about. This is exploring some of those consequences that we have yet to face. So microplastics, I'm sure we're going to get this definition a couple times, and I'm not a microplastic specialist by any means, so I'm sure there will be better definitions. But generally, it's just any piece of plastic that's smaller than 5 millimeters, which is really tiny. There's also nanoplastics, which are even smaller than that. But that's just the basic way to think about it. So they're just tiny pieces of plastic. So common sources are clothing fibers, like when you wash pieces of clothing in your washer, tire wear, packaging, like styrofoam, and just overall litter breakdown, like your plastic bags, hangers, anything that you can think of that's made of plastic that's in our landfills that breaks down over time. A lot of the pathways that exist for microplastics to get into our water and our food sources is stormwater runoff. So again, that same thing we already touched on, things, water running off the streets, running off your roof. Basically, anytime water flows from up to down, it's going to carry something with it. Wastewater effluents are another thing that can get plastics into our waterways, just because we're going to have plastics in our water already. So it's just going to continue that cycle. And then also atmospheric deposition. That's another one that's a little bit different than people aren't used to. It's basically just when things are coming down from the atmosphere, settling down, they are going to eventually land in water and bind with water to become part of water. So this is a great example of what microplastics can look like against sand. So they're just so tiny, tiny little pieces. And obviously that might be a little bit picked out to be just the microplastics, but they're very small and very easy to get into you without noticing. So on the left, there's a great graphic about what do microplastics look like in the Great Lakes region and how to get there. So it's becoming more in the face of what we are dealing with. People are acknowledging that this is becoming a problem and looking into like, how are we going to deal with this? What do we even do? It seems so overwhelming. So there is some growing acknowledgement of this problem, but there's still a lot of research to be done. So what we know so far about microplastics in Utah Lake is, one, we can base it off of other lakes. The Great Lakes are starting to do some really major initiatives in order to reduce microplastic pollution in their lakes because, again, those are like mini oceans up there. It's a lot of water. So they are doing a lot of work because they have also really large urban interfaces with their lakes, and this is becoming a big problem in their fisheries. So we are getting some research from other lakes. We are going to guess that our main sources in Utah are probably from cosmetics, industrial products, larger pieces of plastics that are breaking down from our landfills and just general use, textiles, like all your clothes, and then tires, etc. So kind of those common culprits. I don't think we have anything pinned down to exactly what it's coming from, but it's probably from a lot of different places. And some of these consequences that we are likely already knowing about. So microplastics can build up in tissue over time after accumulation, not only but in fish and wildlife. This can increase overall inflammation in your body and create motor dysfunctions, etc. Those are kind of extreme, but generally it's not good for you to consume plastic for your whole life. That's probably pretty intuitive to know that. So this is something that we want to try to fix, obviously. So this is some really cool graphics from that same Great Lakes initiative, so that you consume about credit cards worth of microplastics every week, which is kind of scary to think about, you eating a credit card every week. I know I don't like that, but it seems like it's probably pretty likely now. And then like fleece jackets, those are huge culprits for releasing microplastics into your and that gets eventually rinsed down, and same process that we've talked about with runoff. So a lot of these things that we don't really think about have a major influence on how we are consuming these plastics and how they're getting into our environment. So there's a lot of potential impacts that these microplastics can have on Utah Lake and other lakes. So plastics can very easily get into sediments. So that just means getting into all the, essentially the dirt into our lake, which we have a lot of. And that means that they're just going to settle there and they're going to stay there a long time. And they also then eventually work into our microbial communities. And microbes are really important because they do all those nutrient processes that we rely on. So they convert nitrogen, phosphorus, they do decomposition and break things down. They're very important to how we live. And once those become involved with microplastics, it could be really bad. We don't know. And then ingestion by wildlife, so fish that we eat or birds, any of these other wildlife communities, they're equally going to be affected by it, just like us. There's chemical impacts too, so absorption of heavy metals or organic pollutants into our water column. So that just means that the water is binding with these heavy metals, with these plastics or these organic pollutants. And again, that's just a really easy way for us to consume them, just even easier. And then there's a lot of unknowns about Utah Lake and other lakes in our water bodies with microplastics. We don't know what these thresholds are going to look like. Again, that push to that stable state. Are we going to be even further down in our stable states? Are we going to have even more adverse impacts that we aren't even sure are going to happen yet? We don't know. And what does that level look like? How far can we push it? Do we really want to find out? There's also trophic changes. So if you change something at the microbial level, those are at the very bottom, is that going to create a massive shift in the food chain for wildlife and for us? And bioaccumulation is another thing. Same thing with tuna and heavy metals with mercury. This could be happening with microplastics, and we just aren't sure what that looks like yet. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to, question. What is this going to look like for our future? Microplastics are very much in every part of the way we live, just like plastic is. It's very important to the way we live and not really going anywhere anytime soon. But the question is, how do we make it better? How do we make it safer? How do we make it more sustainable for our health and for our communities? So there's a lot of future research that needs to be done. How do we even learn more about this topic that's so new? So first, probably good question is, what is the level of contamination we're at? So what is our baseline? What is Utah Lake and other water bodies that we're getting our drinking water from? How many microplastics are even in there? What does that look like? Is it way more than we think? Is it way less than we think? Finding that out is probably pretty important to move forward. Two is finding out where is it coming from and how does it vary throughout the seasons or over time with drought cycles or wet years. We don't know. And then what are the biological effects and ecological effects? How is this affecting those top-down interactions? How is it affecting our microbes and all those things that have really important impacts on us later on? And then overall degradation. What will this do to Utah Lake? What is this going to do to our water supply? And how is this going to affect our health and the health of our communities? So this is just an example of just seeing random pieces of plastic in water bodies. Microplastics have to come from somewhere, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's a lot of this in our general water bodies overall, and it might not be noticeable. You might look at a big piece of trash and not think about it being, oh, hey, I'm going to ingest this later, but you might be, and I think that's something that's really important to acknowledge for the average observer. And then this has a lot of management implications. How do we actually solve this problem? How do we deal with these unknowns? First, it's good to acknowledge why it even matters. Obviously, water quality, safety, and then the resilience and resistance of our ecosystems. If we're trying to push into that better place, better, healthier state of Utah Lake, this is going to have to be a piece of that puzzle. It's not going to go away. And there's a lot of opportunities for integration and research in monitoring, and a lot of research in our academic settings. I think there's so much room for research amongst our universities and other grants and other academic opportunities that exist. So I think there's a lot of pathways to get there. And in our communities, this is going to change how our communities interact with our water, because people need to be invested in making Utah Lake better and our other water bodies better. So it's not only going to take us as scientists or managers or applicants or anything like that. It's going to take our people actually caring about their health in our communities, making sure that they stay safe as well. And that's going to take them caring about making a change. And then there's going to obviously be policy implications. There's going to need to be changes in broad sustainability and context within the political realm that we might not even know what looks like yet. But there will have to be change eventually, again, to make sure ourselves and our community stay safe. So there is already a lot of management going on Utah Lake and a lot of communities that are involved. So on the right here is our Provo Delta waterfowl chapter, and they really are invested in the lake and they love the lake. They do a lot of hunting and a lot of fishing, and it's really important to their way of life. So I think there is communities that exist on Utah Lake that are really would be invested in this problem, and I think it's important to grow that, to keep getting more and more people involved with the health of our lake and the health of our communities. And then there's just a lot of effort to get rid of carp, invasive species, and a lot of those issues that we have on Utah Lake, but we have yet to break into what does it look like for microplastics or other pollutants that way. I mean, a great place to start is stormwater and some of our water quality issues. Microplastics haven't necessarily been a part of that talk yet. So in general, though, Utah Lake reflects a really long legacy of human alterations that we have been working on and we've been addressing and working to make better. But we are in this new frontier of science and research and potentially consequences of our own plastic actions, because they represent this whole new realm of science and pollution that we have yet to really even discover and know what our consequences of are. And it's something that is going to have a lot of questions around it and a lot more that will be posed eventually. I'm sure we'll find out some very interesting things as we go. And it's also important to understand that these emerging contaminants are very critical for Utah Lake's recovery. Again, there's a lot of pieces to Utah Lake's puzzle, and this is definitely one of them. And if you leave one out, we're never going to finish the puzzle. So it's really critical that we make sure that this is a part of our conversation and management, and also the overall ethical dilemma that we face with our communities here, that a lot of people don't like Utah Lake, but a lot of people still use Utah Lake and benefit from the services that Utah Lake offers. So how do we get people to care and invest in this lake that is really actually doing things for our community in Utah County and Utah Valley? So yeah, and this is a very actually nice picture of our lake. It's so dirty and it looks so gross, but I think me and Luke are happy to take any questions you guys might have about Utah Lake or microplastics, all the things we know. Again, we're not microplastic specialists by any means. I don't know if those exist yet. Maybe they do, but it's not us. So we're happy to take questions. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. My kids love Utah Lake. Whenever I take them to like a mountain lake in the summer, they ask to go to the warm, muddy lake. That's where they like to swim. Um, I do have a question. I know that exactly to what extent microplastics produce harms and what those harms might be is still this open question. And I'm familiar with some of the policy or technical solutions for like eutrophication or nutrient pollution, but are there already top line policy recommends or technical recommends for reducing microplastic pollution in an urban area like this?
Oh, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. I think there are some policies that do exist out there, not necessarily in Utah yet. I think we are kind of emerging on this frontier that we are figuring that out. And again, we don't have a baseline yet. We don't know what our level of contamination looks like, but I think in some other areas there is some new technology, some new policy that's coming out that is going to be very important for how we deal with our water quality in the future. And I think a lot of those policies align with water quality in general. So doing some extra filtering, more regulations on wastewater treatment, really big stormwater management plans within large urban communities. So I think those tools are there. They just haven't necessarily been put into Utah's tool bag yet. But I think we're getting there. Hmm?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think in general, we need more we need more science policy connections, right? Um, you know, in for Utah Lake, we're largely trying to catch up with problems that were it took root decades ago, right? Maybe a century or more ago, some of them, like carp. And we can spend all of our time on that. But foresight, I think, is, we know we're going to have problems increasingly with our ecosystem as a result of microplastics, PFAS. There are other challenges out there that require some proactivity. My dad was a character, and I remember back in the 80s, he was terrified of plastic. He was like, someday we're gonna find out this is in everything, right? He didn't want it in the house. He didn't like it on anything. He would go nuts if you put plastic in a microwave, right? He was like, you got to watch out, right? And the guy was a sheet metal worker, right? He's not a scientist, but he had enough foresight to go, this is something to be concerned about. I think just in general, policy does not look ahead in that way. It prefers to pretend that something isn't a problem until it can no longer ignore it.
Kind of a two-part question. What's the current state of Phragmites and carp? And then also, what is the plan for the growth of Vineyard and Utah City and how that's going to impact the lake?
Okay, well, I'll take the first part of that question, and Luke will take the second part for sure. So there's been a lot of progress and a lot of management that has been put out there for Phragmites and for carp reduction. We've seen a lot of progress in our Phragmites reduction. We went from about 12,000 square acres in 2012 when our management program first started, and now this year I think we have about 1,500 is all, and it's very sparse. So that's over like an 85% reduction in about a decade, which is very impressive. We're very happy with that. And again, we're actually pushing into a new frontier. Now that all this Phragmites is gone, we're waiting to see, okay, what is coming back passively on its own? Are these ecosystems going to be able to recover themselves, or are we going to have to help? And that's where we come in and do some active restoration. So we're kind of getting into a new frontier there. But I will say plants and weeds are a little bit easier to deal with than living fish. Fish are a little bit trickier. So carp has been one of our most wicked problems that we've dealt with in Utah Lake. And again, I want to emphasize how big Utah Lake is and why getting rid of a very large population of fish may seem easy. But there's a lot of nuances that come with it. So there has been a lot of progress. Up and down over the years. It's a living and growing population, so we are going to see some decline with our management actions, but then as soon as those maybe stop or something happens with funding, we're going to see a bounce back. So we're kind of in that phase right now where we're doing some experimenting and some exploration into new technologies, new management style, for how do we actually deal with this problem in the long term, because it's easy to think like with weeds or with like Phragmites, you can get rid of it in a decade because why not? But plants don't move. Plants aren't going anywhere versus fish are always trying to get away from you. I think the easiest way to think about it is I tell people that imagine all of the cats in Utah County got out at one time, but they could fly and it's pitch black and you have to go try to catch all of them. Have fun. And it's like, okay, and cats are the same way. They reproduce really quickly. They survive in a lot of different ways and they're hard to catch. And so that's exactly what it's like trying to get rid of carp. And you tell like, it's like, oh, wow, they're really hard to get to and really hard to catch a lot of them to make a difference. But again, we're looking into some new technologies right now and a lot of partnerships and collaboration are going on to find funding sources in order to investigate this new technology. So we have still had a large reduction in carp over the last decade since we've been treating it. Oh my gosh, it's measured in tons, but it's a lot. It's a lot of fish that have come out of the lake. And kind of the measurement that we use is percent reduction of biomass, which is biomass is just the weight because it's easier to weigh fish than it is to count fish. And so I think in the first iterations of like population studies that they did, that the overall reduction that we're looking for is about only having about 25% of the original population left, or 75% reduction. And we've gotten really close there a few years, and then it'll bounce back, and then we've gotten close. And so right now we're probably sitting somewhere in that like 50 to 60 of our original biomass, kind of just fluctuating in that middle, but we're not really sure. There is some studies going on right now to monitor that a little bit more particularly, but we've had a lot of management change and a lot of technique change in the last few years. So we're kind of on a new frontier for that too.
My job for the Utah Lake Authority is I'm primarily rainmaker, right? Like I try to bring in money so that Addy can do her job as effectively as possible. And assuming that Congress unshuts down at some point, and then also assuming that they pass a budget, Senator John Curtis has secured $1.2 million for us for invasive species. It's not a massive amount, but it is a great starting point. And so we intend to apply that to both the flying cats, the carp, and also to Phragmites. And we'll take that money, we'll add it, we'll use it to get additional funding, and the goal is pursue frag and other invasive vegetation all the way up the tributaries to the lake as well, in addition to going after carp in a big way. As far as Utah City, I mean, Utah City is something we keep an eye on. I communicate fairly regularly with the developers, and we have a conversation with them. I will say this: there's a lot to like about Utah City from a lake perspective, and the reason is that if growth is inevitable, as we were told, then and growth is going to come to Utah County, I'd much rather that it come condensed at one point by the lake than say that it go and spread all along the southwest side of the lake, where right now we have basically nothing. But there are projections that show a lot of people going there, and that would dramatically change a lot of things about the lake. And we're trying to understand whether or not that can be sustained as well. So the idea of concentrating people, recreation services, etc., in one spot, I'm very good with, because that's much easier to work with than sprawl that's going to create a whole set of new interfaces between human lake urban lake interfaces that we have to try and figure out how to manage.
Question, final one. Yeah, so I was thinking about the potential interaction between the carp and the microplastics. So since carp are bottom feeders, have we looked at accumulation of microplastics in carp? Could we see them potentially as microplastic vacuum cleaners that we then are removing from the lake, and potentially they're helping mitigate some of the microplastic accumulation?
That's a really good question. That's a really interesting way to look at it, because I mean they kind of are already our vacuum cleaners in a way, vacuum cleaners that weren't invited to the party. But they do a really great job about, since they are in like the sediment, they do act as major bioaccumulators. So we already do testing for them, for things like heavy metals, mercury, PCBs. We actually did just recently do a PCB update on them and found really major decreases in the last 2 decades. I think the last time the testing was done was in like 2003, and we've seen like major reductions to basically like fully edible levels that they like don't have any restrictions yet. It's not like super official yet, but we've seen a major reduction, which is great. So I think looking at it with the microplastics is an interesting thing, because one, we'd have to determine our baseline, if we even have a lot of them here yet. What does that look like? But then we would come to weighing the risk of, do we keep carp here to deal with microplastics, or do we get rid of carp for all the other issues that they're causing? So it's kind of one of those things where you have to weigh the pros and cons, and I think we don't know what those cons or those pros look like yet with the microplastics. So I think that would be something you'd have to further investigate in order to answer that question fully. But that's an interesting way to look at it, I think.
I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to test, right? Like, because we've seen that with PCBs, as Addy was saying, right? They vacuumed up a lot of PCBs, a lot of what came from Geneva steel, and then we removed 30 million pounds of carp. and it seems to have been a helpful way of indirectly removing some toxins. So yeah, it might be a way.
Please join me in thanking Luke and Abby.